So already there's that kind of incubator of movement, of meaning, of relationship between religion and people and what's happening. And it was political. When it was brought to the stage, it was meant to provoke change. A lot of the times, especially in its early development, that was its purpose, was to provoke change in this, this righteous sort of way, without trying to be violent about it, right? This was that expression. And so I think that history of where that movement comes from is something that has to be tapped into. And I think that's what we're talking about, is certain people have the ability that's outside of, this particular culture, to tap into that energy and provoke that same type of connection and expression. And I think we want to find out how that's done, because we find a lot of the times you have what's called the token Black, right? That's the opposite of what's happening. The single Black person in a predominantly Caucasian company or white company.
Right.
So that's been happening for a long time. So we just want to get the opposite perspective. Yeah.
So that's a great time, Dougie, to
let's get our guest in.
The conversation. So we're gonna bring
I can't wait to see this person. We're
gonna bring in Tracy Vogt. We're gonna bring in Kaylin Horgan. Shout out!
Wow.
How we doing, people?
What's going on?
Trey, hey, how are you? Oh, there he is, the man of the hour.
You ain't supposed to be outside. You're supposed to be inside quarantining, Huggins.
You know they ain't doing any of that shit in Florida.
And we keep it real on We Talk Movement.
Yes, we do. Ain't no sugarcoating here.
No. Thank you guys for.
I'm on my phone, so
there's
I
Tracy.
can't see everybody at the same time.
Same.
You have to swipe over
on your phone.
Say again.
See, this is why you got to be on the computer.
I see Tracy. That's okay.
So, Christopher.
It's like Hollywood Squares. It keeps popping.
I love it.
Christopher, we want to start with you and just kind of bring you into the conversation. Why don't you let the audience know a little bit about yourself, what you do, and how you are connected to Black dance, as well as to Marc, as well as to Tracy, as well as to Kaylin.
Oh my God, that's a mouthful.
That's an hour-long response.
Well, I'm as old as these trees behind me. I've probably been around as long as these trees behind me. And well, how do I start?
Where did you start?
I started in high school in Boston.
Okay.
Not in my freshman year at Purchase. I got into Purchase and Juilliard at the same time. I wanted to go to Juilliard. My mother wouldn't let me because they had no campus. And Purchase had a campus. And we had no money to get me an apartment if I went to Juilliard. So started off at Purchase. That's where I was introduced to Lamone and not even Horton. Lamone, Moore Cunningham, and Graham. So that was really my background. Never had taken an African class. of course, back in that day, there was no hip hop and funk and all that stuff didn't exist. So here I am for the great majority of my training. I'm learning white techniques of white choreographers. I'm learning Horgan, I'm learning Lamone, I'm learning Graham, and that's how it was for a long time. And I never really studied African. I took some I've taken African classes, and I've taken Ron Brown's classes, whatever those are, a mix of this and that. But yeah, that's how it all kind of started. So when you talk about me, when I speak about myself in Black dance, I have to really stop and pause, because I've only ever learned white techniques by white pioneers. And I never really studied African. I've taken African classes, and sorry, I lost the tone.
Oh, you're still there.
Yes.
You still there?
Yeah, I couldn't hear who was.
Oh no, it was a faux thing with the live thing. The live feed was dropping, so I had to reload it. It was just something that came in. It was your voice, actually.
Oh, it was actually my voice. Right, I thought so. I was like, who said they didn't study African either?
So Christopher, this is Marc here. I have a question for you. So it's interesting that you talk about that, because I think that it's so interesting that a lot of times Graham and Tracy, you can speak to this too. A lot of times Graham and Horgan are the modern dance foundations for a lot of Black dance companies, and it's so ironic that
exactly.
that these techniques were created, by white choreographers or teachers. So it's very interesting that those are the two primary modern dance techniques that are pushed for African American dance companies. It's very interesting, just the reality of that.
Even Alvin Ailey based his company on the Horgan technique.
Right.
He was trying to continue Lester Horton's aesthetic.
Right.
But I think that's a very important thing to mention, that even as Black dance pioneers, a lot of our understanding of technique and visual aesthetic was coming from the white techniques that existed before, the Graham, the Horgan, and all those sort of, not to say that it's a bad thing, it's just the fact of the matter. And I think that also speaks to the notion of how we had to enter that particular realm of dance, and how we had to accommodate, we as Black people had to accommodate, and in many ways very similar to how people of Yoruba practice appeased the Catholic Church by attaching the Orishas to the patron saints. We in essence had to attach our spiritual grounding and all these things that came across the Middle Passage with us. We had to attach that to the Eurocentric aesthetic, and then connect that Eurocentric aesthetic to that spiritual, cathartic, that storytelling that Dougie was speaking about, and all the experiences of being a person of color in the environments that we are navigating. So yes, when you look at Ailey, you see Graham, you see Horgan, you also see Dunham, but Dunham itself is an amalgamation of all these different styles and techniques.
Exactly.
So it's important that we mention, like, most of us, much like yourself, Christopher Huggins, like when we got into dance, we were learning the techniques of the teachers that were teaching us. In Philly, one of the things about Graham and Horgan specifically in Philadelphia at UArts is that our Graham and our Horgan teacher were both Black. So ultimately, like, even though I was learning these Eurocentric techniques, I was learning them from Black people.
Right.
So there was never the disconnect of the cathartic experience. There was always the notion of moving with vigor and moving with passion. And I think that is one of the things that I spoke about with another friend of ours, is that is sometimes the thing that draws people into Black dance, is that feeling, that emotion, that it's not about the precision and the execution of the exactness of the step. It's about what you feel while still having the technique. You know what I mean? So,
right. Because it's funny, because, you know, a good example of that is Deeply Rooted in Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
Kevin Jeff is always speaking of the Black aesthetic, or, you know, the Black experience, when even a lot through his choreography, his movement, his you know, the meanings of his works. But Kevin teaches Graham to his company. Most of their warm-ups are Graham based, you know, which I think is interesting, because he's using that technique to put across what he wants to say in his work.
well, you know, that's the interesting thing about what is considered Black dance. I think when I got hired at the University of the Arts back in 2011, and I was teaching for their African dance and diasporan division, I was teaching Ethio-modern dance. I was working with other Black artists in the Philadelphia environment at the time, and Jamil was one of them. And Jamil said, what actually is Black dance? Because I'm Black, but many people look at what I do and don't consider it to have the Black aesthetic. But it doesn't really matter to me who's doing it. It's still Black dance for me because it's coming from me. This is the vision. It's the lens through which I see it. And that's oftentimes interesting to see how other people that aren't of the colored demographic embody this concept of Black dance and engage with it in their own way. Hence why we have Tracy, Vogt, and Kaylin Horgan involved in the conversation, because we want to hear their experiences of how they've navigated themselves through their careers as people that don't have as much pigment as us, but are still very much associated with the Black dance community, you know.
And can hang with the Black dance community.
But that's the thing. It's about
they can hang.
The reason why they can hang, specifically these two women that are here on the discussion, is because they recognize that how they're engaging. And I think for both of them, they've also had enough experience within urban and Black culture outside of just dancing with these people to where you understand how to navigate the different types of personalities within the Black community. You know what I mean? So I would like to start with Tracy Vogt, so she can introduce herself and give us a little background about her and how she's connected to Mr. Christopher Huggins, as well as to Marc Spaulding and Dougie and myself.
Well, absolutely. You know, I didn't even hear of Black dance. I didn't know what Black dance was. What happened for me, I was at a Dolly Dinkle dance studio, and Philadelphia came to my hometown in Erie, Pennsylvania. And I don't know, you know, maybe it's white privilege, but I didn't even see that it was a Black dance company. I just saw this dancing and I was like, what is this? There was no modern dance. You know, I knew jazz, I knew tap, I knew baton, and I barely knew ballet. Yeah, I was headed on a jazz career. That was where I wanted to go until I saw that. And I was like, wow. So when I was in high school, they started this new performing arts school. And there was a woman, Renee Vickery, who told me that if you really want to be a dancer, you have got to go to ballet. And I was like, oh, I hate ballet. And she's like, you have to. And I said, well, you know, my parents can't really afford all these lessons. She said, well, here, this company is looking for somebody to do the Arabian section. Ironic, right? My first Nutcracker, I'm the Arabian section. So I know, it's crazy. So they offered me a scholarship to this ballet school in exchange for me performing their Nutcracker. Well, you know, I was in class with like 12-year-olds because I think I was 16 or 17 and I didn't know the technique. I never heard the word sickle until I was 16 or 17. So I was really lost and I hated it. And they all looked at me like, who's that old lady in the back? And I would just hide behind somebody to get across the floor. Until Philadelphia, when they came to town, they also taught a master class at this ballet school. And Kim taught it, Kim Barris taught it, and JB came to the class and watched the class. And then, you know how Mama Kim is, and she gets you engaged. And I was like, oh, this is it. And then at the end, she was like, all right, everybody's gonna audition. This is an audition. Let's see who would get the job. And then at the end of it, she's like, you would get the job. And I was just like, so, for me, that made a like definite decision in my life. So that's
validation.
Huh?
Go ahead. Validation.
Yeah.
So
yeah. I was complete. And then I think Ailey too also came to town. So I saw that too. And I like the idea of a repertory company. And for some reason, there aren't a lot of white repertory companies. I think like Hubbard Street at the time was the only one that I knew of. And I was not going to Chicago. It was way too cold. That was farther north than Erie, Pennsylvania. No way. So I ended up going to UArts. And that's how I ended up at UArts, because I was following Philadelphia. And JB doesn't really remember this, thank God. But I was in the training program while I was at Philadelphia. So I would do my classes at UArts during the day and go to Danko at night and take the evening classes with Denise Jefferson, Celia Marino, I think Dolores Brown. So, I was kind of in that training program. She doesn't remember this time, thankfully. So I was at UArts for about 2 years, and I went to Jacob's Pillow for a summer. And Milton Myers was there, Anna Marie Forsyth, Judith Jamison was there, Danny Baracheski. I was like, this is completely, of course, Mama Pat was always my mama since I got to UArts. I fell in love with Graham. I was like, this is amazing. So she was on me. I took every class I could.
Shout out to Pat Thomas.
Yes. Mama Pat. I still have my tattoo, my Bubbles. She called me Bubbles. So, that kind of established what I wanted to do. And at that summer program, Anna Marie Forsyth and Milton Myers talked to me and they said, the Ailey Scholarship audition is coming up. You might really want to consider it. And I was like, what? Like, I'm not good enough for New York. No, God, no. So I actually canceled my flight back to Philly and took a bus to New York City, auditioned for scholarship. Now, mind you, this is where I met Roxanne. Roxanne was 13 years old at this program. No, 16 years old at this program.
Wow.
Yeah. So Roxanne, she wasn't out of high school yet. I was in college. So me and a friend of mine, we both went to the Ailey audition, and I decided, I was like, this is what I want to do. I got the scholarship. I went to Mama Pat and I said, what do you think? And she said, Bubbles, no way. You'll get lost. You'll just be another white girl up in that system. And I was like, oh no. I was devastated. I was completely devastated. And I was like, but it defined me in that I had to make a decision. Like, if I get lost, it's going to be my fault, but I got to take this chance. Plus my parents couldn't really afford college. And at the time, there was no way that I was thinking about teaching ever. No teaching. I did not want to teach. So that's how I went to, I ended up going. And then, a couple years later, I came back and took class, and, I had been demonstrating for Denise Jefferson when I got there because I knew Graham from Pat. So I was already kind of a leg up than most people. And, Pat eventually said to me, Bubbles, maybe you made the right decision. So I had a little bit of a moment of that.
I think you did make the right decision. So,
well, later on, now
definitely.
that I'm older, it's different, right? Because now I teach, and now this whole thing comes up with degrees versus careers, and all of that. So this, this is a whole conversation that I heard you guys talking about, and I was like, but I wasn't thinking of teaching, honestly.
The conversation last week talking about teaching in academia and all that kind of stuff. I think for many of us, other than those of us who were teaching while we were already in college, many of us didn't think of teaching as a career. When you get into dance, you get into dance to perform.
Well, it's just one of those things that is just a part of the experience. A lot of times dancers, especially when you're really young, unless you're really passionate about teaching, but a lot of times, those teaching opportunities come up as a result of you being a dancer. If it's you teaching master classes or at Danco, when, as you know, being on the road, you have to do certain amount of master classes, or, but it's not for a lot of dancers, it's not something that you're actively pursuing, especially when you're younger. Now, maybe when you get older, you start to see that. But
I started teaching in
thing.
Los Angeles just to survive.
Yeah, because it becomes a survival skill. It really becomes like a useful secondary skill, unless you're really passionate about it.
It provides a stable income for some of it, for people.
Yeah.
That,
there are people that are passionate about it early on, but most.
Yeah.
Dougie?
I started teaching early. 15.
And that's why I mentioned that about, except for those people who were teaching early. I know you, but that's why I mentioned that comment, because I know you were teaching. I mean, the ironic thing is that I started teaching my first dance classes probably 3 months after ever taking a dance class. Somebody, when I went home to my hometown, they were like, "Oh, you're a dancer," and I was like, "Well, I'm paid to do one gig, so let me go out." And I think that and Dougie and Marc will speak to my character. I think naturally I'm like a natural teacher. Like, I'm always trying to tell somebody what to do. So naturally it was an inevitable stage in my career that I adjusted fell into.
Let's get Kaylin in there.
Thank you for that synopsis. And when we're gonna connect these stories in a second.
Oh yeah.
Kaylin, why don't you just tell us your background, where you from, how you got into what you do, and Tracy, as well as Christopher.
Yes, of course. It's crazy. Tracy and I are so similar in many ways. I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, so not too far away from Erie. I also started at a very small dance school. I will say that my dance teacher used a lot of Janet Jackson music growing up. So like that was about the beginning of my black dance experience as a tiny kid. But then I turned 13 and my mom wanted to put me in the performing arts high school in Pittsburgh. So there I went. And after about 2 weeks of Kappa, yes. And after 2 weeks of being there, two of my dance teachers, Greer Reed, who is a former dancer of DCDC, and Leslie Anderson Braswell, who is a former dancer of Dance Theater of Harlem, approached my parents and said, she needs to do something a little bit more. There's fire. There's a pre-professional company that they have, and they ran after school. But it was a black dance. It was a Pittsburgh Black Theater Dance Ensemble. And I knew that I was going to be one of two white kids even auditioning for this. But I was clueless. I had no idea. I didn't even know that what a black dance company was. Same. I knew about Disney and cruise ships. That's about it at that point. And but I go into this audition and I'm wearing pink tights and a ballet bun, and it's an African class. So I got thrown into the fire pretty quickly, but I just rolled with it. I went with it and I loved it, and I was accepted into this. And one of the first choreographers that we had was Terrence Green. And he is, if you know black dance, you know Terrence Green. Every aspect of it. If you don't have fire, you do by the end of it. And I remember being young and like not knowing how to activate this thing that all of these other dancers had. And I remember my friend Chantel came up to me and whispered in my ear and said, just look up and make it hurt. for some reason. And we were doing a piece called Faith, which is a modern liturgical piece, and it just opened everything. And we started to perform this piece at churches, which I was born and raised Catholic, which my dad is an atheist. Like that also meant absolutely nothing. But being in Black churches, Baptist churches, like, you know, you just get exposed. And from there, I would say, honestly, in the complete contrast of Christopher, the majority of my training in a high school level was predominantly Black dance. Well, Horgan and African, and most of my teachers were Black. So I was being exposed to dance companies like DCDC, Philadelphia, Alvin Ailey, Ron Brown. These were the only companies I knew about. So to even say that there was like a Cunningham dance company, I didn't even know who that was. But I knew who Carvin DeLa, you know, I knew all these other Black dancers and Black choreographers. So yeah, I knew Donald Byrd much more even before Martha Graham, and Martha Graham is from Pittsburgh. So it's the concept of that is really interesting. And soon into that, I would say it was my sophomore year of high school, we had this incredible choreographer named Christopher Huggins come in. And he had this piece called The Call. And that was a whole nother level of a kick in the ass that I wasn't ready for either. But again, it's like these experiences that I've always found in Black dance is like these untouchable moments that you push yourself to evolve beyond. And it's it was always such a holistic, we would, you know, cry and bleed and vomit, and like these experiences that I did not have in a dance studio, or what I was experiencing that other kids that were going to PBT, Pittsburgh Ballet Theater, in my class were experiencing. These were intense spiritual. We would pray before rehearsals and after rehearsals, and it was just very much more holistic. And I remember the moment, much like Tracy, that it was like a moment. Greer took me to see DCDC, and I still like, I was, you know, sophomore in high school, she took me, and up until that point, if you don't know me, I'm 4'11", I'm tiny. So tiny. So I always found that my dancing opportunities would be limited because of my height and my body type. And then I saw Sherry Sparkle Williams on stage, and I was like, and then I got to meet her after the show, and I was looking at her in the eye. she's also 4'11", and DCDC was it. I wanted to be in DCDC. That was what I was going for by the end of high school. I graduated as a 17-year-old, and my parents were like, whose apartment are you trying to buy? Like, get in Dayton. You can't get one. So I ended up going to Point Park. I didn't really even want to talk to people at Point Park. I was like, I'm gonna be here for 2 months. When I turn 18, I'm out. But very, very, very little Black dance teachers at Point Park during that time. Garfield was not the professor there at that time. So that, in a weird way, was like a culture shock to me. I was so used to being around Black dance teachers, Black dancers, Black dance aesthetics, that I get tossed into Point Park, which was not the case. The majority of my teachers were white. So that was a transition for me, for sure. But fast forward, I stayed at Point Park. My jazz teacher, Jody Welsh, pushed me. I cried and cried and cried, and she pushed me to stay. I got through, graduated in 3.5 years, which was because Greer Reed reached out to me my junior year of college and wanted to create the dance company, August Wilson Center Dance Ensemble here in Pittsburgh. So yeah, I was blessed, and I got to graduate from Point Park University and walk into my first full-time professional dance job. And our first choreographer was Robert Battle. And our second choreographer was Christopher Huggins. Third choreographer was Terrence Green. We had Antonio Brown, who was from Bill T. Jones. We had Camille Brown. We danced with Darrell Grand Moultrie, like Ed Kim Beers Daily. Like we were just enriched in this, and that company was untouchable. Fortunately, the August Wilson Center went bankrupt. We all lost our jobs. And I blindly moved to Chicago because why not? There I was introduced to Deeply Rooted, which I actually managed that company for a year and a half. Kevin Ayaga Jeff sat down and taught me how to make Excel spreadsheets. Talk about a blessing. Like that was incredible.
Shouts out.
A very smart man. That's a smart man.
Yeah.
He's not of our world. He is not of our world.
Yeah.
In the world, but not truly, Kevin Iger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, and then since then, I also took a class. I was choreographing for the Emerging Choreographers Showcase for Deeply Rooted one of the summers, and Deanna Hyatt was teaching a Graham class. And I did not really, I knew of her, obviously, who doesn't, but I was going across the floor and she said, "Who is that?" And so that's KK. She came up to me after class and invited me to the Williams Henry Contemporary Dance Company, which I still dance for today. So yeah, currently I dance for Williams Henry. I dance for Antonio Brown Dance in New York. I assist Christopher Huggins. And I
sure does.
He takes me everywhere around the world. He's my favorite. And I also now going back, I now teach at the high school. Now I teach at my high school at Kappa. So yeah.
I have to make a mention that I met Christopher. I mean, I met Christopher before IABD in Philly, but I met Kaylin at IABD, and again, bringing back to the first part of our conversation that may not have made it on to the live. For myself, Marc, and Dougie, Marc was really the initiator of bringing Five, our company, into IABD. I remember when it was 2007, because I was living in Ethiopia. My son had been born, and I came back to the States to do a project with Raven. And during that time, it was around the time of IABD. So Marc was like, we should go. And we all participated. Dougie taught. Me and Marc sat on a panel, and I think Marc performed a piece to some of my original music. And that was really my first introduction to IABD. And aside from Philly, my introduction really to Black dance outside of Philadelphia. And so all of us here have a connection to IABD. That's how Tracy and Kaylin met, and then found out that they both used to work in William Henry.
Well, and that's also how I got my job at Philadelphia. Christopher taught my class. And wow. JB said, I had the company. You did. It was in Dallas.
At the IAB auditions? At the IABD auditions?
Yeah, he taught the audition because I had auditioned twice in Philadelphia. And JB didn't hire me. So I went to Dallas. Me and Roxanne got a bus and went to Dallas and auditioned again. And she said, "Are you following me around the country?" In her JB way. Yeah. I said, she was like, "You must really want to be in my company." And I was like, "Yeah." and then, of course, JB, I'll see what I can do. And then Kim called me like 2 days later and had me come in and take class. But yeah, Christopher, it was you that got me that job.
He don't even remember.
No.
And what's ironic, another ironic thing is that I met Kaylin through Crystal, who was on the show last week.
Dishes are done.
What was that?
What'd you say?
Crystal Frazier.
Yes.
Yes.
I love
Frazier.
Crystal Frazier. Crystal Frazier. That's my favorite.
You can't be on 4G down in Florida trying to have a conversation while everybody on Wi-Fi.
Right.
Still
Now,
Out of the streets.
you heard what I said yet.
now,
5G is killing everybody.
Okay, that's a whole different conversation. We're not
I
gonna
love-
get
now,
political.
I first, right. Now I first met, well, Christopher. I guess I saw him perform before I even met him. But growing up, see, I grew up in a performing arts high school, black dance training environment, and so I've been going to IABD, since I was 14. And I remember seeing Christopher. Christopher, what was the name of that solo you did, where you throw water, you throw like a bucket of water on yourself at the end of the solo? I'll never forget that solo.
That's like flash dance.
I was just thinking that.
That was the first time I saw you
but
dance.
I wasn't in,
And
but
that
I
was at
wasn't,
IABD.
but I wasn't,
Huh?
I wasn't sitting in a chair.
No, you were not. You were not. You were not.
I choked to death.
You were not.
I threw that water in my face. It was at
was a
IABD.
very traumatic blackout. It was like water blackout.
It was actually I got to dance more. That was at IABD.
You did? Okay. It was a long time ago.
Philadelphia. In Philadelphia. It was 1996.
Yes.
97. Right? I think that was the last time.
Was it 96?
Is that right? Because I danced. I taught. Yeah. I taught for Philadelphia for the first time for the summer program in the summer of 1996, which was after IABD and JB. And I danced at IABD and JB saw me perform at IABD.
Okay.
That solo was created for me by Dwight Roden.
Okay.
And it was created for me by Dwight Roden. We did it in no time. I was a wreck. I was still learning it as I was performing it.
Were you in a company at the time? Who were you working with?
No, I wasn't. I was freelance. I
So solo artist.
I've been freelance since 1988.
Wow.
Christopher, can you talk a little bit about, now we're talking about, being an other in a black dance environment. Can you talk, because you've worked in a lot of different environments in Europe and all throughout the United States. Can you talk a little bit about maybe working in an all-white environment, or, or an all Japanese environment, Asian environment?
Right. They're all people ask me that all the time. Like, what is your favorite country to teach in? And I don't have a favorite. I love all of them, though I do favor my Japanese students because I love their work ethic. Not saying that other people don't have a work ethic, but the Asians have a work ethic that just, I'm sorry, a lot of times it cannot be matched. It just cannot be matched. It blows me away sometimes. They do not stop practicing until it's right. And when they go on stage, they never make mistakes. Never. And if they do, they're in a corner crying. I mean, like bawling. Each country is so different. I mean, each culture is different. Each country is different. But when I go to each country, I'm bringing me. And that's all I know. I'm bringing my aesthetic. I'm bringing me. So, and that's what people have latched onto. And I get everywhere that I go, everywhere that I've taught, the Japanese, the Italians, the Norwegians, the English, it doesn't matter, the Swiss, wherever, every place I've taught, the Jamaicans, they all say that I pull emotion from them, or I bring an emotion out of them that they never tap into. I don't know. I've always I'm very passionate about what I've done, what I do, and what I love. So I guess it comes across in my work that I do with them. I can't tell you how many classes I have taught. Doesn't matter what country it is, that, you know, after we're doing a combination group after group to group, and there are people crying. And I'm like, what are you crying for? What are you crying for?
They're moved.
And it's just, they're
And it's
moved.
hard.
Yeah.
They're moved. Huh? Say again?
Your choreography is hard too.
Tracy and Marc,
I love it.
chime in on that too, because you worked in his ballets.
Yeah, but I'm.
Oh, I love it. I love it. If I could get in a time machine.
I like to,
I love it.
I like to think I'm elevating people. They are hard.
Yeah,
But I like to think that I'm.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I told you before, the first time I retired from Philadelphia, it was because Enemy Behind the Gates. That was a hard piece to do every night. And at the time, Danko was doing, every piece was a closer. I mean, you start the show with Sweet Otis by George Faison,
Yeah.
Right.
And then at the end was Enemy Behind the Gates. And so I was like, I don't think I could do this anymore. And of course I did, because I had to.
Mm-hmm.
No.
Right.
That wasn't because of, don't blame Enemy. That's because of JB's bad programming. Now let's call it for what it is. JB gives.
You can get away. You can get away with that.
I sure can, because I've told her she puts together a brutal concert.
Yeah, right.
Brutal. Admit it.
You see Tracy.
Yeah.
You see Tracy and I are like quiet. We're like
it's the truth. It's the truth. It's the truth. I've been in JB's office many a day, going back and forth with her about Enemy always closing, about doing Enemy too much.
Yeah.
But Enemy, because Enemy always suffered because of the brutal programs that she would put together. And by the time you got to the end of the concert, of course you're dead. Of course you're dead. And Enemy is tired.
We were tired.
Enemy is full of gram and ballet technique.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It reeks of it. There's nothing. If your classical is not on, if your gram is not on, you ain't doing Enemy. You ain't getting through Enemy.
Yeah.
Kaylin, do you know
Right.
this piece as well?
What was that?
Kaylin, do you know this piece as well?
I've never done Enemy, actually. I've done many. Oh goodness, I don't even know how many now, Christopher, of your pieces that I've done. But I think even consistently, Christopher's piece, you have to, as he talked about, like, it's so passionate, but you're going in such a place, and the characters that you're portraying, no matter what the story is so detailed and specific. Like, there's the majority of the pieces that I've done for Christopher, I've had to do research on who I am in the piece. There are a lot of historical references that he tells. They're thought-provoking, and it requires incredible technique, but that's not the point. But you have to have the technique so that we're not looking at the technique. And
right.
I think that's the beauty of his work, is like, it puts you in such a different world, but it is asking the masses of you as a dancer, but at the same time, you have to be so stable in your technique so that we are actually watching the story and not the dancer. Right. If you dissect the piece, it's impressive, but we don't want to see it, and we don't want to feel impressed watching it, because the story is so deep.
And you can't be fumbled on stage. Period.
Yeah.
And Christopher,
a lot of my choreography, I choreographed on my body.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, well, if I can do it, they should be able to do it. They're better than me. That's my thought. Not really. That's my thought. I'm like all of Enemy, I choreographed Enemy Behind the Gates. I did every part of that ballet on my body and my assistant's body. did
You
every
sure
part
did.
of that body.
I was the original cast, Christopher. Yes, I remember.
I know.
Yeah.
I choreographed all of that stuff on my body, and I would give it to them as I choreographed it. So I'm
It's
thinking,
interesting
if
you say, because I remember
I'm able to
watching
do that.
in this.
Uh-huh.
Go ahead. Now, I remember watching you in the studio certain times before class or before rehearsals, moving through your phrases like full out in a full out drench. So
Yeah.
I definitely can verify that. You know, you definitely embodying the movement and moving through your phrases yourself, like working the movement out on your body. I specifically remember seeing you do that. Yeah.
I think that brings up an interesting note of knowing what the visceral experience is of executing the choreography. The technique needs to be there so you don't fumble, but the reason why a person like Christopher Huggins, as well as all of us who probably choreographed, why we do the movement first is because that's going to inform the intention behind the movement.
Exactly.
When you do it, you feel it, then you're like, oh, this is what I'm attempting to say with this phrase. This is the emotional disposition. This is the image that's in my mind and who I'm feeling in that moment, which allows you to convey more detailed information to the dancer that you're setting the work on.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that, you know, as it sounds though, Christopher, you may need a dramaturge researcher for your work. You be going in with characterization.
I don't know.
Enemy behind the gates.
I think, let's see, Tracy.
On Danko piece.
Tracy,
remember?
I remember.
Go ahead, Tracy.
Yeah, it was a Danko on Danko piece, but it was 2001. Right? And September 11th happened, right? When that whole thing went down.
That weekend before.
It was. I remember going to Philadelphia on that day, and we were all like, what are we doing? And I had to teach the company class that night. And I was like, what am I going to teach? Like, everybody's families were in New York. We couldn't get a hold of anybody. Everybody was just kind of shook. And so that ballet, like, you could not halfway do that piece because you knew what it was about. You know what I mean? Like, that's why that one was always so difficult at the end, because it just, you know, you were angry, like at the end of the show, you still had that tension and you like ready to kill, you know what I mean? Because and I used to just say, I'm not that angry anymore. I think all the anger's out. Like, but you were so invested, you had to be, you know.
Yeah, that's and yeah.
You sound like that.
Like Mario.
And the funny thing is that when your Wi-Fi is slow like that, you don't even realize you just talking, and like his screen is paused right now. But you know he's been
he's singing
dance
now.
companies ever saw of mine. Well, KK screen paused too.
That was on your end though.
Can you all hear me?
Now we can.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we can hear you for the last 20 seconds though.
I'm sorry. For the last
Was
45 seconds. Oh, I'm sorry. No, I was saying.
No Wi-Fi.
Say again? What about my Wi-Fi?
We can hear you. We can hear you, Chris.
I'm not saying anything. I'm just gonna listen. I'm just gonna listen and sit here. You all talk. I'm just gonna listen.
No. Oh.
We need your vocalization. We just want to make sure. We was waiting for the time to catch up. It just never really. It took 25 seconds for it to catch up. So
it was like halftime, and that band came in and performed, and now you back.
Oh Lord. Oh well. All right, just keep it moving.
I have a I have a question for Tracy and Kaylin. Was there ever a time where you felt compelled to maybe want to move away from Black dance and say, hey, maybe I go in a different direction? Can you talk a little bit about that? Where did you experience those moments, or ever question whether or not you should be?
I can, because, one of the other thoughts, when I was leaving Philadelphia, it was like, where do I go now? And after the second time, the first time I went back to Pennsylvania, I was supposed to get married, and then my father died, and I ended up dancing with a company in Cleveland called Verb Ballets, which their rep was completely the opposite. It was Martha Graham, it was David Parsons, it was Paul Taylor. I had never had that experience, you know what I mean? So it was a very, very different shift for me in the way that it worked. There's nobody screaming at me in the front of the room, or in the wings going ah 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 ah. You know what I mean? Like they don't operate in that way. But there was also a part of me that was like, if I'm gonna do this, I've got to go back to Philadelphia. So I ended up going back to Philadelphia because I did miss that whole energy around me. It's a different way of dancing. You call it like dancing for the blood, or you know what I mean? Like you dance from your soul. It's different than just achieving the line.
Right.
And I missed that kind of dancing. And so that, that led me back to Philadelphia. And then, considering what do I do now? I thought of Martha Graham Company. I that was where I was kind of thinking, but then I was like, I'm a little spicy for that group. Like they would probably be looking at me like, who are you? So, it was just, it is a very different thing though,
Right. Yeah. It's interesting because it's all technically the same Eurocentric movement. Yeah. But it's just the storytelling, the way in which it's conceived and achieved that makes the difference, which is interesting. And it's just I think that's kind of what it boils down to. Because and I didn't even think about the fact that, and I'm glad Christopher Huggins mentioned that, that most of his background was from predominantly white techniques. It was just expressed through his experience as a Black man going, in America, pretty much. So there's this relationship of tapping into that story, that journey, and it affects you. Yeah, I've been able to experience that particular level of performance because it is a different experience, and if you haven't had the chance to take your emotional aspect of your theatrics to that level, then I suggest try it out, because it is something other than your technical ballet. You find it sometimes in tap, depending upon the hoofers that are doing that, where you can reach that particular level of intensity, but it's still not, I would say, as intense, because you have all of those techniques behind it, which I now find very interesting. So that means that what is Black dance? It is this mixture of culture.
In the amalgam.
It's American dance. You know what I mean? It's just the story in which we're telling it, I think.
Right. Kaylin, can you respond to Marc's question about that notion of wanting to go into a different direction other than Black?
Being pulled in a different direction, right?
Yeah, totally. During my time with the August Wilson Center Dance Ensemble, I was actually also dancing for a improvisational dance company called the Pillow Project here, and we did a lot of touring overseas in Europe. So we did a lot of work with like jazz musicians and how dance and improvisation we have the same brain wave as like a jazz musician improvising and tapping into that. that was predominantly white dancers. So I still kind of had, in a weird way, like my foot in a white dance company door in a sense. But same as what Tracy was saying, there's just something very unique about the training and the protocols and the energies of Black dance companies that I always gravitated towards. With that said, I definitely hit a point about year 4 at the August Wilson Center where our host venue was the August Wilson Center for African American Culture. That comes with a lot. I experienced being in photo shoots and being cropped out of photos. I wasn't invited to a couple of photo shoots. There was a couple of pieces that I was not allowed to be the soloist because it was a Black woman's experience, which caused a lot of controversy. You know, the dancers, my fellow dancers, found that to be an issue as well, in the sense of, in a lot of ways, it was a false advertisement. There are white company members in this company, but only the Black dancers are being chosen for the posters or to represent the company. And I hit a point.
Reverse racism.
Yeah, in a sense, and as a white dancer in this company, I didn't have much to say about it. It hurt nonetheless. You know, we got to do a photo shoot with Lois Greenfield, and I wasn't even like in the picture. Like, you know, it's hurtful in a sense. And one of the pieces was actually, the piece that I was not allowed to do was actually Faith, the piece that I learned in high school. I was an ensemble member in high school. I taught the piece, I coached the piece, and I explained spiritually what the dancers should be going through. At the time, I was attending church, so I could really connect with what this character was supposed to be experiencing. And I was teaching a dancer who was Muslim. She performed it, and I was not allowed to. So it was tricky, you know. Now, you know, the August Wilson Center Dance Ensemble folded, and I kind of had this opportunity of like, okay, what direction can I go next? I continued with the Pillow Project and did some other like side projects. And then Terrence Green called me and asked me to be Mary in Coming of the King, which is essentially equivalent to Black Nativity, which was incredibly controversial, if you could imagine. So, but
only Terrence.
The first year that he asked me to do it, I actually turned it down. I was like, that's a lot. That's a big choice. And I didn't think that I was able to do that. He asked me the following year, like, okay, are you ready to do this? And I said yes. And the way he explained it was basically like, if we're talking about spirit, if we're talking about the spirit of dance, my community has to see this. They can't expect things to look a certain way and be upset when, you know, he was like, you just have to dance. You just have to dance. So, and it's interesting because his school is almost 100% Black students. And the kids didn't even question it. It was really interesting. There was nothing, the kids didn't say anything. The parents, I definitely, you know, getting water with my dance partner, Philip, would go to the water fountain and they would comment, you know, Jesus and Mary would have been more so his color. Like, yes, I know. I am aware. Yes.
Oh my God.
Oh yeah. And I will say the opening night, you know, they introduced our characters. Joseph will take his wife Mary, and I ran on stage and I audibly heard people talking about me. And that was something I had never experienced in my life. And I just, in the back of my head, I kept hearing Mr. Green's voice, like, girl, you better be flawless, like just over and over. And I just danced. But you know what? It's incredible because the response was nothing but positive afterwards. And you know, who knows how everybody left and how it took and how people left with that. But I will say that no negativity was brought to me. I felt very welcomed and yeah, it was a beautiful experience. It was scary as hell, but it was a beautiful experience. In my experience, I can say strongly that being a minority in this community is much easier than the opposite. I can say that.
Tracy, would you speak about just a little bit about, did you have a similar experience of your career? Your
I did, you know, JB, she was really cool with me in that, you know, she used to joke with me all the time, Tracy, you're not white, you're light skinned. And I was like, I'm Polish and German. And like, you really can't get much whiter. I'll take it.
Can't get any whiter than that.
You know, but, you know, I took it. Yeah, there was one piece, Tally Beatty's piece, Prettiest Skin Deep, Ugliest to the Bone. There's a ladder solo in that piece.
Yes.
You know, and I had that solo. And yes. I remember they're carrying out as 4 men. So imagine it's 4 Black men carrying a white woman hanging from a ladder. And all of a sudden I heard boo. And I was like, it just like, I was like, oh, okay, it's on. You know what I mean? Like, it kind of was like, oh, you know, it kind of shocked me. Yes. And I was like, wow.
But Tracy,
by the end, they were screaming. But you know what I mean? It was just that moment of like, right. Oh.
Yeah, because you have that thing, and I'm sure Kaylin does too. You have that thing, much like people of color who enter those environments where people are looking at us like, oh, what they gonna do? We have that show and prove mentality. Oh, you gonna boo me? Let me turn it out for you real quick. Like, let me show you what it is that I'm a mistake.
It's very interesting because I compare it almost to the Apollo mentality. You know, in the Black community, they will boo you. We can be judgmental even of each other. And so if you hit the stage and they don't they don't approve, they will let you know.
Yeah.
And but on the same token, if you impress them, or if you are really genuine and you are really dancing from a place that they can relate to, they will give it up. They will give it up for you. But there definitely exists that they're very audible about judgment.
Yeah. Well, and that's something with, you know, dancing in a white company or as a Black company. The thing that I liked about Philadelphia was that you always knew where you stood with JB. She made it very clear, you know.
Yes.
In other environments, you don't quite know. It's kind of
that is so true.
So true.
That is so true. I'm not mentioning any names, but most of y'all know me. I only worked with one real professional company. I never knew where I stood with that company.
Yeah.
I was there. Even 11 years after leaving the company, I was still like, oh, that's how y'all looked at me. Interesting. And, you know, like, so yeah, sometimes it's very important to know. And I think that's that level of transparency a lot of times within the Black community and within Black dance is there. It's truthful, it's honest. And as we know, sometimes the truth does hurt, but it's the reality of somebody's perspective, you know?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
Wow.
So, go ahead, Marc. Did you have something that you needed to say?
No, I was just gonna say. Now, I wanted to kind of wanted to talk a little bit about where you guys maybe see Black dance today. Like, what do you see in Black dance today, and maybe in terms of aesthetic, in terms of accessibility, in terms of race relations. Like, where do you see the state of Black dance today in 2020?
Yeah, I think it's stretching. like massively. I think that so many people have different interpretations of what Black dance is at this moment. Like some people really want to hold on to the traditions of it. Some Black choreographers, Black artists do not want to be considered a Black artist. They want to be considered artist. Black dance is also in that same realm becoming popular. Black culture is like, as if it wasn't already, but Black culture is on like a high of popularity right now. So I think it's stretching. I think that this conversation is coming up a lot more often of defining Black dance. And yeah, I think that there's many, many interpretations of what exactly that means at this point.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
What do you think, Christopher?
Especially, can you hear me in real time?
Yes.
I don't want my 4G to mess you all up. Right, Raz?
It is what it is.
I think a lot of the new generation, the millennials, that they're reaching back to the more Black aesthetic, I think, in dance. They're really holding on and sticking to their roots. And they're not, and the Antonio Browns, and they're not, they don't rely on the Horton techniques, the grand, really more ingrained and engulfed into their culture, their background. So where we come from. So I think they're speaking more truth to power, and especially in their movement vocabulary, which for me is more grounded in African more than anything.
Yeah.
When I see their works now. You know, when I see a lot of these young millennial choreographers, Black millennial choreographers, their work is more grounded into the Black aesthetic, I think.
I think that's a great like metaphor for, you know, I'm not really a millennial. I guess I'm past that demographic. But it's a great testament to looking for that notion of equated value within aesthetic, within techniques. So I think one of the things that might be compelling a lot of the younger Black artists to create in something outside of that Eurocentric aesthetic is to give more value to things outside of that aesthetic. We recognize that we're not European. So how do we show things other than that aesthetic that is still reflective of our experience? That's where hip hop comes into play. Now, hip hop is a part of popular culture. So a lot of Black choreographers would have been raised in that culture and been associated with that. So you're attempting to find ways of expressing your identity in a platform and in a space where people are utilizing the same types of vocabulary. The only thing that you can draw on that makes you unique is how you've manifested your own personal experience in connection to these particular styles of movement or techniques. And I think that's what we're seeing now is more of an embodied experiential transmission of what these younger people are going through, what they have gone through. And still at the same time, many of them recognize that they are part of another generation. So we stand on the shoulders of our ancestors. A lot of the millennials recognize where their training is coming from and understand the aesthetic and can cite, okay, this is something that I gained from this particular artist or choreographer or a teacher that I worked with and how it applies to their own work. I think a lot more younger choreographers are definitely thinking more about the work that they're creating as opposed to just creating. And sometimes that does help. Tracy, did you have something that you wanted to add about where you think Black dance is now, or possibly how you're contributing to where it's going?
Well, I mean, I agree with what everybody's saying, you know, with kind of with the, you know, the concert dance thing is kind of colliding with, you know, when you have choreographers, and a lot of hip hop is now melding into the concert dance world, you know what I mean? So a lot of that is kind of mixing. I mean, I know that at Philadelphia, in one program, you may do a, you know, a neoclassical Jean Hill Sagon and then a Rennie Harris piece, you know what I mean? Like, so it also is pushing the dancers to, you know, sometimes they like to stay in one box and say, you know, I only know this. Today's dancer, you know, I tell the kids all the time, if you have to, you know, they say stand on your eyelash, you better figure out how to stand on your eyelash without hurting yourself. But you're gonna do it. You know what I mean? Like, to be that, you know, that well-rounded of a dancer, you know?
That versatile. You can't be a one-trick pony no more.
No. Yeah. And that's
Yeah.
hard for young dancers to understand, you know? They kind of put it in their mind, like, oh, I'm just a ballet dancer, or, you know, and it's like that world doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
it's
It's about
evolved.
movement.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I come
I
from
mean,
a
I think
totally
with the
different.
with go ahead.
I'm
Go
glad.
ahead, Christopher.
Go ahead.
No, I was just
Go ahead,
saying
Christopher.
I just come from, I'm much older than everybody. So I just, my experiences and my background are from the times that I grew up in. You know, I started dancing in the 70s. I'm almost 60 years old in a couple of years. So it's like,
Black don't crack.
I have I had to like, I'm constant, because I've lived through generations and so many different styles and metamorphosis of these style and technique, and now I'm still embrace other forms that are coming up now, that are being introduced now, and accepting, you know, the different ways of how hip hop has really taken over people's way of moving, and the aesthetic of hip hop, and more African, and more, all of those things are melding into each other. And I didn't have that experience. I don't come from that. I didn't have that because it didn't exist, you know, when I was first learning to train, which is why you know, all I had was ballet. After I learned how to you know, start dance, how to dance, didn't know how to dance. I was teaching myself a lot, and especially in high school, where I only had cunning days. I would go into Boston and seek anything, getting enough out of just learning Monday through Friday. I went to a high school that had a module system. There were 7 modules, and after every 4 weeks, my courses were changing. So I would have like modern for like a month, and then I might not have it the next month. So it was constantly changing. So my beginnings were really sporadic, kind of really all over the place for the first 4 years, until I had some real structure when I transferred to Juilliard. So, but that was really kind of the same thing in a lot of ways. I was kind of forced to switch schools because the Kazuko Hirabayashi thought that Purchase wasn't challenging enough for me. But in my eyes, everything was challenging for me because I couldn't do jack doodly. That's why I was such a beast when it came to learning. When I finally got it, when I finally understood what I was supposed to be doing,
I was unstoppable. Unstoppable. I was doing 4 classes a day. I would go to 4 classes a day. 4 was like my limit. I was just a beast. In my own eyes, I was a beast. I was a beast.
Christopher, can you talk a little bit about your time in LA? Because I think it's easy to overlook that you did spend some years in Los Angeles, and how that affected your movement. Right. How did that affect your movement quality, spending time in Los Angeles, which is a different aesthetic, even during that time? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, because when I first moved to LA, that's when reality kind of set in. Before LA, I worked for things, but I was kind of given things as well. Just being a male, when I was auditioning for colleges, I was getting full rides thrown at me. Back then in 1981, I was getting full rides thrown at me for Juilliard, for Purchase, for University of Massachusetts, University, just all these different universities. I was getting stuff thrown at me. When I went to LA and I started auditioning and getting world for me. Also, in that time, we're talking about 1988 when I moved to Los Angeles. That's when funk and jazz were more prominent. And I was something that I wasn't really used to doing. I could do jazz, but I started teaching jazz because that seemed to be the aesthetic that people were looking for, especially over in Europe and in Japan. They wanted jazz teachers. They didn't want modern teachers. I would have never have worked as much as I did in the 90s teaching Horgan, because nobody was looking for it. I mean, to this day, nobody in Italy knows Horgan or teaches Horgan, really. But living in that LA world, because that is a totally different world, I had to reinvent myself in a lot of ways. Because when I was auditioning, and I was coming from a concert dance background, my whole world was concert dance. And I had to really reinvent myself. And I feel like I did that when I made it down to the last 2 boys to be hired by Madonna for her Blonde Ambition tour. Now I beat out all of those boys in LA. She had her New York auditions. She had chosen her New York boys. And now she was in LA choosing these LA boys. And I was down to the last 2. It was me and Gabriel. And Gabriel got the job. Prettier than me. He was pretty, and we were good friends. I knew Gabriel from New York. He got the job, so be it. But all those New York, all those LA experiences, that's why I worked in LA. I worked for Disney, and I did a few movies, and I did a couple of foreign films, but that's when I'm getting into learning how to teach, because I had never taught. And so my teaching kind of took off in LA, because a year after living in LA, I was invited to Japan. And that was my first experience of traveling by myself, something that I had only been doing for 1 year. I had only been teaching for like 1 year. And then that's when it really started to take off. I was getting choreography jobs in Japan. I was teaching 12 classes a week. 12 classes a week. Only day off I had was Sunday. Monday through Saturday, it was 2 classes a day, every day. And I did that for years. years and 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 years.
Mhm.
Not just in Japan, in France, in Italy, and other places too. But I think my LA experience really made me who I ended up being at the end when it came to teaching, because LA is a hard cookie to crack. If you're not in that A list, on that A list, you're just another person on LA.
Mhm.
So true. I'm sure that the two
You gotta
guys,
be on that
Absolutely.
the two guys who live in LA now.
especially in the agencies. You know, you gotta be on the A list.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It
Yeah.
hasn't changed. It probably will never change. That's their culture out there. That's their culture in LA. You got to be on the A list, and you know, of their agency. And I wasn't on the A list. I got called. I went to auditions. Janet Jackson called me for Escapades, and where was I? Overseas teaching. And so I missed that grand opportunity to have a vignette in her Escapades video.
Mhm.
I was called for Michael Jackson when he did Dangerous on the what was that, the MTV Awards or something like that.
Yeah, with Travis Payne
yeah.
and Lavelle.
Right. I got called for that too. It was gone.
Shouts out to Travis
So
Payne.
I had a lot of opportunities. Yeah, I love Travis and Lavelle. Those were the it boys. Those were the it boys at the time when I was in LA. They were the it boys. So, you know, and I was kind of in that group. I was kind of hanging around them a little bit, but yeah, whenever a teaching job came along, I was out because I wasn't going to wait around LA for someone to hire me, and I had to survive.
Mhm.
I had an apartment to pay for. You
That's
know,
what
I was grown. I was grown by then. I couldn't call mommy and daddy, and mommy
Right.
had to pay my rent. That
Mhm.
wasn't happening. That wasn't happening.
Right.
And my mom was actually deceased by then. So yeah, that LA thing was I loved it. I loved it. I loved living in LA, but after 12 years, you're old in LA.
Mhm.
After 4 years, you're old in LA. I mean, I was only 27, but I'd be in audition with a 17-year-old. And that's a 10-year stretch. Now, you don't feel old, and I didn't feel old, and I didn't look old, but 27 to 17, youth always wins for the most part, sometimes, depending on what it is. But you could be considered old when you're only.
Yeah. Christopher, you've touched on a really interesting point that I mentioned earlier in the show, was that even though you were a working professional, you found the sustainability in teaching. You made sure that your rent got paid. You made sure that you had income coming in, because as we know, as performers, when you don't have that contract, then your employment is not there. You got to find other means of money. And in that commercial,
like I'm doing now.
In that commercial,
I'm doing like
we always do.
Right now.
Well, can we get as we bring things to an end,
because
closing remarks from everybody.
I'm gonna.
Christopher's still talking. He, his 4G is a little slow, so
4G, man.
I wait for his 4G to catch up so he
Yeah.
can.
Leave him alone.
Or Kaylin gonna defend.
What?
In froze mode.
So why don't we start? Why don't we start with Kaylin? You have any closing remarks?
Closing remarks.
Anything? Any projects you're doing? Anything you want to share with us? Or?
Closing remarks. Projects I'm doing. I mean, during this quarantine, remote learning for Pittsburgh Public Schools, which is great.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Actually, better than I expected, to be honest. My kids are handling it very well. But closing remarks, just thank you. I love these conversations. Really good, positive, connecting conversations. So yeah, just thank you for all of this.
Awesome having you. Yes, definitely.
Thank
Miss
you.
Tracy.
Thank you.
Well,
Tracy.
you know, it's funny you talk about the teaching thing, because like I was saying in the beginning, I had no desire to teach, you know. So at Philadelphia, JB paired me up immediately and had me teaching with Kim Barris. And then I remembered that experience that I had with Philadelphia in that master class. I knew the power of that. And then I fell in love with teaching. And then I was like, I need to do this, which is how I met you three, because I think I taught you at UArts, like when Philly from Mama Promise. I remember Marc gave me the most evil look for a tilt promenade. Yes, I remember those days.
you just backed out that promenade, pulling that that heel forward to bring the leg.
But thank you. But thank you. I know, just balancing for days.
Well, yeah. You know, I had to fight for that. But you know, and so now that's what I'm doing now.
Anything you're working on right now?
Yeah, right now I'm on full-time faculty at the South Carolina Governor's School. So I do that. And I also teach in Atlanta, sometimes with Anthony Burrell. And I started a little modern dance company for, you know, kids from age 10 to 18 in Atlanta. So on Sundays, because of course the Philadelphia mentality doesn't leave, you have to work 7 days a week. I drive to Atlanta and I work with this company and I bring in choreographers and I have the kids choreographing. But that's what I'm up to now. So
awesome. That's awesome.
Thank you guys. No, this was fun. Yeah.
Yes, likewise.
Mr. Huggins, you got any closing remarks?
Keep the eyes on the road.
Working on, Christopher.
On Monday, I'm going one-on-one with Daniel Harder. We're doing a live Q&A on Instagram.
Awesome.
Come join us at 5
Love
o'clock.
Daniel.
Come join us.
I will post this flyer on our Five Productions page so you can check out
my
and
son.
Post it on Instagram.
But thank you guys for inviting me in. Great to see what you guys are doing.
Well, it's a pleasure and it's an honor to have all three of you in on this conversation and to see your faces and just to hear your perspective on movement in general. I think it's a great thing to have people in the industry having this type of discussion and to have legends in the game be able to speak their mind freely. And that's all of us in our own perspectives, our own rights, our own different categories and avenues. So kudos to everybody. And thank you so much for dropping in and talking about movement and sharing your love for it and your perspective, because it's much needed. It's much needed right now.
Thank you.
Yeah. I really appreciate
the way in which we bring things that are on the margins into the forefront. You know, we have to find the ways in which we can mediate. We're all brokers of the culture that we've been exposed to. So we get to carry that forward into the students that we now teach. And Christopher, you had touched on something about generational. You know, you're of an elder generation to us, but myself, Marc, and Dougie and Tracy are of a different generation than Kaylin. So we are of that generation that really started to think about how we were synthesizing this information into our own identity. And I think that that's a reflection. It's reflected in what the millennials are now creating. There is a synthesis. There is this interconnection of things that may have been in the margins before, but now being brought into the forefront and into the main stage. What our responsibility is to make sure that people know where this information is coming from.
Right.
Absolutely.
And to be well-rounded with our knowledge. So I much like following up what Dougie said, like I commend everybody who's here on this panel and everyone that we're connected to for paying it forward, taking the information that we've been given, taking the knowledge that we've been given, and taking this opportunity to use movement as a gift to share our own experiences with people that we encounter in the world. May we all be blessed to continue to move.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Give
Thank you,
thanks.
Love you
guys.
Such a joy.
guys.
Love
Yes,
you.
much love.
I love you too.
Much
And
love.
it's such a joy.
Yeah.
You guys have a great
Well,
weekend.
You
Yeah.
too.
All right.
Until the next time.
Much
All
love.
right. Bye.
Peace.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
So, and there you go, and there you have it, gentlemen. I appreciate you both again for always being here and us collectively coming back together to make sure that we can share our knowledge and experience of movement and our network of movers with other people that may not know how interconnected all these pieces of movement are, you know. And it's like, I feel like in a lot of ways we're really connecting some dots. So appreciate y'all. Love y'all.
Hey, man. Always a pleasure.
Until next week. Till next
IB
week.
for life.
Absolutely. All right.
Appreciate everybody tuning in. We'll be back
Good
next
weekend.
week. Talking about
Yes.
we're talking about the two. We're talking about 5. Our company, its establishment, and the 3 major tours that we did with Raven Simone and a lot of the people who were involved in the creative process and what it was like working with myself, Marc, and Dougie. So yeah, tune in next week. We'll make sure to post it and send out some advertisements and keep you all engaged with our show 5 Live as we talk movement.
Yeah.
Let's
move, we move, y'all move. All right.
Love it. We talk movement.
Hey, man, bring that song back as we leave out.
Got to bring the soundtrack back in, huh?
Bring it back, y'all. Bring it back.
Throw music.
Just going to get a little dance as we part out.
Understand how serious this is. Well, get curious, it's curious, big biz. I dance when I walk, I dance when I talk. My dancing is sharp like a ram. My life is the bullseye, dance is the dart. I don't even need no beat, cause dance is my heart. Get it? Yeah, it's my heart, so I'ma stand out pumping. Do a pirouette and land out crumping. Now that's crazy. Jazz, lyrical, modern dance, a tap, baby. Some ballet to some hip hop. Now is that lazy? It's hard work. You finish last, we start first. You're one-minded.
Crazy.
Start search. Now you can go on a beat and watch the flow beginning, man.
On a search.
Yeah, but I'm a versatile entertainer. We love y'all. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week.
All right.
Peace.
IB.
IB.
Next week.